So for about the past 5 weeks, the standard lineup has been Vi Heimer, Sea Monsters, and Frostbite control, with a little bit of variation between the exact strategy brought by some regions, like Karma Ezreal and Sejuani Swain popping up, but it looks like that is finally about to change. Before this was the standard lineup, the standard was typically Indoor Spiders, Bannerman, and Heimer Vi, and with both Misfortune Bannerman / Scouts and Shadow Isle Anivia on the rise, we could see a return to the on-release meta in terms of regional compositions. But to overtake the standard, you've got to beat the standard, so let's take a look at how this lineup pairs up. Assuming the Piltover and Zaun Ionia decks are banned, and we'll get into the implications of the Jamfest format a little bit later, but then you're left with Frostbite and Sea Monsters versus Bannerman and Anivia. While the Bannerman can out-aggro the Sea Monsters, it's pretty unlikely that it picks up a win versus Frostbite, but the Anivia deck should be able to take care of either one of these decks with relative ease. Sea Monsters into Anivia is what I call a bait counter, something that on the surface may look like a counter, but in reality isn't. This generally comes down to one surface level game-winning interaction, in this case Devourer of the Depths onto Anivia. But in practice, this interaction is almost never going to go the way of the Sea Monster player. For starters, the Sea Monster player pretty much always needs to be deep for this to have any chance of working, meaning we're generally already going to be on turn 7. While I have seen Sea Monsters players hit deep on turn 6, it usually takes most of their mana on that turn to do so, so we'll assume a deep turn 7. This means that the Anivia player has 7 mana to play with at least, and isn't going to be proactively tapping out at any point from here on out, since Anivia is the only card they do that for in the later stages of the game. This means Vengeance, Grasp of the Undying, and Glimpse Beyond are all potential outs to the Devourer play. Grasp is obviously the weakest and has potential to get blown out by Vile Feast, but we're typically seeing this interaction most often fall to Glimpse Beyond, for which there is no answer from the Sea Monster player shy of a Riptide with Nautilus out, because once Anivia is in the death pool, then you have Harrowings and Rekindlers to worry about, which is why Devourer is so hard to pull off. You have to line up a Devourer for every Anivia they hit, and you can't let a single one enter the death pool, or things start to snowball out of control. The go wide with giant Sea Monsters game plan is also generally not going to work out, given that the deck plays multiple copies of Ruination and has no qualms about killing their own board. Of course, the Maokai win condition is always on the table, but all these players have to do is hold an Anivia in their hand and bring some back with Harrowing or Rekindler, and then they have, an infinite supply of harsh winds and they'll never deck out, so it's generally not going to be a safe strategy, especially because they can put so much pressure on the board in the meantime, and they're not really that hurt by having to harsh winds every turn. This means the matchup in theory comes down to the Sea Monster versus Bannerman matchup, which we've seen going the way of Bannerman more often as the full suite of Relentless Pursuits are coming out in every iteration of the deck and taking advantage of Deep's weaker mid-game. I think there's a lot of potential for Karma Ezreal to overtake Vi Heimer in the top spot this weekend, as it seems to pair much better into the perceived tournament meta, so please keep that in mind and consider making the switch to better protect yourself. I want to take a little bit of a deeper look into some of the newer decks and give you a quick rundown on how they function, maybe what their good matchups are, things like that to help you give you a better understanding of what you're walking into this weekend. So we'll get started off with Karma Ezreal. While the deck hasn't changed too much in the last few months, I did want to double down on my prediction that this deck will overtake Vi Heimer this weekend. With so many aggro decks out there, and with the Jamfest tournament allowing you to only bring 2 decks, and almost ensuring a high presence of Ionia Piltover, people now more than ever are going to be looking to bully the Heimerdinger deck. Karma Ezreal is harder for these decks to pick on, and that's really all there is to say about it. Karma Ezreal takes better advantage of the Eye of the Dragon, doesn't need to hold on to its removal until after the Heimer has come down, and overall reactivity is better versus aggro decks, especially when you have this small of a number of units, and of course I do think this deck has a much better time against Brahmanivia. Speaking of the Brahmanivia, this is Bruised by God's second place list from Duels of Runeterra 11 last weekend, and this deck can outlate game the Heimer Vi, and with the cost reduction on Anivia, it's not doing too shabby versus aggro. This deck seems really solid with a lot of good matchups across the board, and can be one of the more consistent control decks for handling board-centric matchups, and it pairs really well into the old standard standard like I talked about earlier. The new Braum feels phenomenal for dealing with aggro and even pushing through damage thanks to the initial overwhelm Poro, since it's not something that can get chump blocked by someone losing their board to Anivia. Overall, the deck is very versatile and extremely powerful. This deck is filled to the brim with overwhelm units and burn, and with the overwhelm units all having a fair amount of toughness, it's difficult for units to line up effective blocks, use removal spells on them, and it's difficult for elusives to race you since their blocks are ineffective versus your high attack units. You also have access to all of Noxus's burn, as well as the atrocity to potentially end the game as soon as you get a leveled Darius. The Harrowing doesn't care how big your opponent's board is, since most everything coming back will have Overwhelm, and this deck, alongside Crimson Elusives, are a great example of the late game strength of aggro in the current meta, meaning you can still take games off of control decks. Both Scouts and Lucian Bannerman look pretty similar to what they used to, though players really leaned into the newly buffed Genevieve last weekend. On top of the 3 copies of Relentless Pursuit in both versions really taking advantage of the Scout mechanic, it's not uncommon to see single combat cut from the list entirely. The strength of single combat in Bannerman was that your units were overstatted and down trading onto something was pretty easy with it, as well as being a great tool for dodging removal or even up trading when paired with riposte. In the more aggressive version, your units are more appropriately statted, and single combat really only gets value by dodging removal, and up trading isn't nearly as easy. Part of the reason we see 3 Concerted Strike coming out of this Scout list by Bruised by God instead, it's a more consistent removal option for a deck like this. Also, unsurprisingly, Unyielding Spirit is completely cut out with the champions in these decks as well as the top end curve being less synergistic with the card, and of course it got nerfed pretty hard. I think we're about to see a fall off of Frostbite control. On my tournament tier list, which has a link in the description below, I wanted to move the deck down to tier 2, but it performed consistently last weekend in Duels of Runeterra, but now with Freljord promised to Anivia, I think we're going to see the deck put on the back burner again. This deck comes and goes in the format, and I'm sure it's not the last of this deck we've seen, but the meta isn't as grindy and board-centric as it was when this deck made its return. Noxus and Freljord are both very powerful regions in the current meta, and I think we're about to see them separate again. Of course, if you do want to keep them together, Braum Swain is a more aggressive approach that some players have started moving over toward, though I don't think it's necessarily a great tournament deck. And finally, I wanted to talk about Nab. While it's never been the most popular in region-locked formats, I've noticed a stark drop-off in its ladder presence. Obviously, this wasn't due to the nerf to the Nab package, but the package is only 9 cards, and if the meta doesn't fit well for the other 31 cards, then the deck is unplayable. While Nab is just the name of a package and has been played in other decks before, it does seem that the current best home for the package is found in Twisted Fate Ezreal. While it's not quite as mid-range as the Sejuani version, as far as I've been able to tell, it certainly doesn't play like your traditional Ezreal deck. I've never seen Ezreal win a game for anyone with this deck, but since Riptide Rex auto-levels it, and I've spoken to the strength of the Piltover and Zon version of even then the Bannerman-esque version from patch 1.2, it's an adaptation that I don't necessarily hate. You're still focused on tempoing out your opponent with the Nab cards and some cheap, effectively statted units. Previously, Nab beat aggro by matching them on board and grinding them out with stolen cards to gain advantages, but with aggro shifting towards elusives and overwhelm, you can no longer match them on board as a primarily Bilgewater deck. Instead, Barrel Generation alongside Piltover and Zon removal lets you still scale into the late game to grind out stolen cards with Riptide Rex, but now Ezreal exists as an elusive blocker, a Mystic Shot generator, and a finisher. And I very much mean finisher, not win condition. This deck will never 20-0 you with Ezreal alone, giving it a similar feel to the Freljord version, but the lack of progress day means that even if Ezreal were to sit around for a few turns, he still wouldn't be able to win the game on his own, which in a deck like this is completely fine. Ezreal's meant to get that last 6 to 8 points of damage. But my point was more that I see this as the Nab deck for the foreseeable future, and it fits pretty well into aggro lineups. I've spoken in the past about how Piltover and Zon usually gets left behind in such lineups unless you're specifically running Teemo Burn, and I think while it is the third deck and therefore likely not to get played at Jamfest, it does slot well with Crimson Elusives and Braum and Nivea, which may seem like a weird roundout to the lineup, but these decks do all try to pick on the slower decks of your opponents. Now let's take a look at some lineups. I'm going to keep this a little more brief because I feel like I said my pieces earlier, but I think the most popular lineup this weekend is going to be Karma Ezreal, Braum and Nivea, and Demacia Bilgewater, followed by Sea Monsters, Karma Ezreal, and Frostbite. We tend to see gradual fall-offs of these kinds of lineups, and of course, Karma Ezreal can be replaced by Heimer in this or any lineup. and round that out with something like Crimson Elusives, Braum Anivia, and Scouts. It's very possible I'm overstating the prominence of the Anivia deck, but I truly think it is one of the better decks in the format and does a good job of picking on Heimer Vi, which is typically the goal of aggro lineups. With Demacia and Piltover and Zon being such hotly uncontested regions, it feels like most lineups start at Vi, Heimer, and Scouts, and then figure out which powerhouse deck you want to make out of Shadow Isle, Noxus, and Freljord. Now for Jamfest, things are a little different, but not super different, and I'm really expecting Karma Ezreal, Braum and Nivea to be the most popular lineup, and as for the aggro lineup, you have a lot of variation that you can pick between Kinku Elusives, Misfortune Scouts, Harrowing Darius, or Crimson Elusives. Of course, you do have to mix and match your regions at that point, but I'm sure you guys can figure it out. I do think that Kinku Elusives is not a good deck to bring in if you are thinking that Vi Heimer will be more popular than Karma Ezreal, but I do think it's fine into Karma Ezreal. Those are kind of what I'm thinking baseline for the two most popular lineups. In a format like this, a lot of personalization gets to come out since you don't have to worry about the third deck, and it is an extremely hard format for someone in my position to predict. And that is going to do it for the 10th installment of Tournament Tactician. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for 10 long weeks of sticking with me. Of course, I do have to plug my Twitter. Follow me on Twitter from the Boulevard, BLVD. If you do want to figure out where and when I'm casting this weekend or any other weekend, as these things do tend to change quite often. Sometimes it's my channel, sometimes it's someone else's channel. Sometimes I do NA, sometimes I do EU. And of course, in the description below, I am also going to have my patch 1.4 constantly updating tournament tier list. Things are getting a little weird on it just because there are so many different formats being played out in the grassroots scene, but of course it is fun to watch. And until then, good luck on your tournaments this weekend.